Maren Hollis was 23 years old, 7 months into a life she'd been building with nothing but her own 2 hands when the sky turned white and the road disappeared beneath her feet. She was carrying her daughter against her chest, a 9-month-old girl named Wren who weighed 14 pounds and had her mother's dark eyes and a way of going completely still when the world got loud, as if she understood even then that silence was sometimes the safest thing a person could be. The temperature had dropped 31 degrees in under 2 hours. Maren's car, a 2004 Subaru with a cracked windshield and a heater that worked only when it felt like it, had slid off the shoulder of Route 9 somewhere between Dalton and the nothing that came after Dalton. See a stretch of road that climbed through the Green Mountains of Vermont with no guardrails and no cell service and no reason for anyone to be driving it in late November unless they had nowhere else to go. She had nowhere else to go. That was the truth of it. She had $61 in her checking account, a diaper bag with 4 diapers left, a half-empty bottle of formula, and the kind of fear that doesn't announce itself with screaming, but instead settles into your bones like ice water and tells you very calmly that you might not survive this. She walked for 40 minutes through snow that was already knee-deep and rising, holding Wren inside her coat, feeling the baby's breath against her collarbone, small and warm and impossibly fragile. And then she saw it. A shape in the white. A door. A cabin she had no reason to expect. A setback from a road she couldn't see anymore, with smoke already curling from its chimney and light glowing amber through a frost-covered window. She didn't knock. She couldn't. Her hands were past the point of making fists. She fell against the door with her shoulder, and it opened, and the heat hit her face like something she didn't deserve, and inside, a woman she had never met was already rising from a chair beside the fire as if she'd been waiting. Maren grew up in a town called Harwick, in the low, flat farmland of central New York, the kind of place where everyone knew whose truck was parked outside, whose house, and what that meant. Her mother, Connie Hollis, was a woman built like a fence post, narrow, rigid, and difficult to move once she'd set herself in a position. Connie had grown up on a dairy farm outside of Harwick. She married a man named Dale Hollis who worked the gravel pit on Route 20 and settled into a life defined by its smallness and the fierce pride she took in keeping it exactly the size she wanted. The house on Mead Street had 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with yellow linoleum that curled at the edges, and a living room where the television was always on and the curtains were always drawn. Dale died when Maren was 11. Heart attack, sudden, on a Tuesday morning in March. He was 44. Maren remembered the sound her mother made when the hospital called, not crying exactly, but a kind of low, sustained note, like a pipe organ with 1 key stuck, a sound that lasted maybe 10 seconds and then stopped and never came back. After that, Connie became something harder. Not cruel. Not then. But closed in a way that made the house feel smaller, the rules tighter, the air thinner. Maren had a brother, Tyler, 4 years older, who dealt with the loss of their father by becoming invisible, slipping out of the house at odd hours, getting a job at the Sunoco station, buying a truck with his own money at 17, and driving away at 18 without a forwarding address. Connie let him go. She let him go with the same expression she wore when she threw out leftovers, resigned, practical, a little disgusted by the waste. Maren was the one who stayed. She was the good one. She did the dishes and folded the laundry and sat with her mother through the long gray evenings of upstate New York winters, watching television neither of them cared about, and she told herself this was enough. She told herself this was love. And she was a good student, not exceptional, not the kind of good that wins scholarships and opens doors, but the steady, reliable kind. The girl who turned in every assignment, who never missed a day, who sat in the second row and took notes in neat handwriting and never asked for help because asking for help meant admitting you needed it, and in Connie Hollis's house, need was a form of weakness. Maren graduated from Harwick Central High School in June of 2017 with a 3.2 GPA and a vague plan to attend community college in the fall. Connie didn't come to the graduation. She said she had a migraine. Maren wore her cap and gown and walked across the stage in the gymnasium and received her diploma from a principal who mispronounced her last name, and when she looked out at the bleachers, she saw rows of parents holding phones and flowers and pride in their faces, and in the spot where her mother should have been, there was a gap, a metal bench with no one on it, and she felt something shift inside her, a quiet rearrangement of expectation, like a house settling on its foundation in a way that would cause cracks years later. She enrolled at Mohawk Valley Community College that September. She studied medical billing. She drove 40 minutes each way in her mother's car, a car she was allowed to use only if she filled the tank herself and was home by 6. She worked weekends at a laundromat in Utica, folding other people's sheets and towels and thinking about the lives those sheets belonged to, the families, the couples, the children who still had clean beds to go home to. She did this for a year and a half. See, she was 19 when she met Jesse. Jesse Pruitt was 26, which should have been the first warning. He was from somewhere outside of Albany, or maybe it was Troy. He was vague about his past in a way that Maren, at 19, mistook for mystery rather than evasion. He had a beard and a pickup, and a job doing something with HVAC systems that he described in terms that sounded technical and impressive, but that Maren later realized she never fully understood. He came into the laundromat one Saturday afternoon with a duffel bag full of work clothes that smelled like machine oil and copper, and he smiled at her, and the smile was warm and direct and uncomplicated, and Maren, who had spent her entire life in a house where warmth was rationed like heating oil, felt something in her chest open like a window in a room that had been sealed too long. They started dating. He was charming. He was physical in a way no one in her life had ever been. He touched her arm when he talked to her. He held her hand in public. He pulled her close and kissed the top of her head as if she were something precious. She had never been treated as something precious. The first 3 months were the best 3 months of her life, and she would say that later without irony or qualification, because they were. And that fact, that her best months were the opening act of her worst years, was one of the things she would eventually have to sit with in the dark and accept. By month 4, Jesse had moved into the apartment Maren was renting, above a hardware store on Genesee Street. By month 5, he had stopped paying his half of rent. By month 6, he was drinking most nights, not a lot, not falling down drunk, but steadily, consistently, the way a faucet drips. Unremarkable in any single moment, but enough to erode something over time. She didn't see it. Or she saw it and called it something else. She called it stress. She called it adjustment. She called it what happens when two people learn to share a life. She was 20 years old and she had no frame of reference for what sharing a life was supposed to look like, because the only model she'd ever had was a mother who drew the curtains and a father who died before he could show her anything different. She got pregnant in February. She was 21. She found out on a Tuesday, standing in the bathroom of that apartment, on holding a test she'd bought at the Dollar General for $3.99, and for 7 seconds she stood there looking at the 2 pink lines and feeling absolutely nothing, a blank white silence like a field of snow. And then everything hit at once. The fear and the wonder and the desperate scrambling math of how much diapers cost and whether she could finish her degree and what her mother would say and what Jesse would say and whether this child, this collection of cells no bigger than a grain of rice, had any idea what it was arriving into. Jesse said he was happy. He said the right words. He smiled. He put his hand on her stomach even though there was nothing to feel yet and said, "We're going to be a family." And Maren believed him because she needed to believe him the way a person in the water needs to believe the thing they're holding onto is solid, she told her mother. She drove to Harwick on a Sunday afternoon, sat at the kitchen table with the yellow linoleum, and said, "Mom, I'm pregnant." Connie looked at her for a long time. She didn't ask about Jesse. She didn't ask about the due date. She didn't ask how Maren was feeling. She said, "I hope you know what you're giving up." And then she stood and went to the sink and began washing a dish that was already clean, and the conversation was over. Maren drove home with both hands tight on the wheel and her jaw set and her eyes dry because crying required a kind of hope. Hope that someone would notice, and hope that it would change something. And she had learned a long time ago that crying in the Hollis family was like calling into an empty room. The pregnancy was hard. She was sick for the first 4 months. Not morning sickness, but all-day sickness, the kind that made her lose 11 pounds and left her dehydrated and shaking on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m. while Jesse slept in the next room with his phone on his chest and an empty bottle of Bud Light on the nightstand. She kept working. She kept going to class. She drove herself to her prenatal appointments alone because Jesse always had something, a job, a call, a thing he had to take care of, and she sat in the waiting room of the Oneida County Women's Health Clinic, surrounded by other women who had partners beside them, or mothers beside them, or someone beside them. And she filled out her forms, and she answered the questions, and she smiled at the ultrasound technician who pointed at the screen and said, "There's your baby." And she looked at the gray, pulsing shape on the monitor and felt a love so fierce and immediate that it frightened her, because she understood in that moment that she would do anything for this child. Anything. And she was terrified that anything might not be enough. Wren was born on October 14th, 2019, at 11:47 p.m. after 19 hours of labor. She weighed 6 pounds, 2 ounces. She had dark hair and dark eyes, and a cry that was sharp and clear and indignant, as if she'd arrived with opinions. Jesse was there for the birth. He held the baby. He cried. And then, in the way that would come to define him, he began to disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in increments. He started staying out later. He started sleeping on the couch. He started answering questions with one-word responses and looking at his phone instead of his daughter and leaving the apartment for hours without explanation. Maren was alone with a newborn. She was alone with a newborn in a second-floor apartment in Utica, New York, in November, with no family support and a partner who was physically present but emotionally already gone. She nursed Wren through the night. She changed diapers with hands so tired they shook. She sang to her daughter the only songs she could remember, which were hymns her father had hummed in the truck on the way to the gravel pit. Songs she hadn't thought about in a decade that came back to her now, fully formed, as if they'd been waiting in some locked room of her memory for exactly this moment. When Jesse left in January, not with a fight, not with a scene. He left the way fog lifts, slowly and then completely. One morning, Maren woke up and his clothes were gone from the closet and his truck was gone from the lot and his keys were on the kitchen counter beside a note that said, "I'm sorry. I can't do this." 2 sentences, 8 words. The sum total of his explanation for walking out on a 3-month-old daughter and a woman who had built her entire fragile life around the belief that he would stay. Maren sat on the edge of the bed and held the note and stared at it until the letters blurred, and then she put it in the trash and went to feed her daughter because Wren was crying and Wren needed her, and Wren didn't care that the world had just contracted to the size of a small apartment with no one else in it. She called her mother. She hadn't planned to. She picked up the phone and dialed the number, and when Connie answered, Maren said, "Jesse left. He's gone. I'm alone with the baby." And she waited. She waited for her mother to say, "Come home." She waited for her mother to say, "I'll be there." She waited for her mother to say anything that a mother should say to a daughter who is frightened and alone with an infant in the middle of winter. Connie said, "Well, I told you." There was a pause. Then she said, "You made your bed, Maren. You lie in it." And she hung up. She hung up. Maren held the phone against her ear for 12 seconds after the line went dead, listening to nothing, and in those 12 seconds, something inside her finished the process. It had started on a gymnasium bleacher years ago. The last load-bearing wall of expectation collapsed. But on what was left was not grief, not anger, not even disappointment, but a vast, quiet clearing where a mother's love should have been, empty and cold and open to the sky. She had 2 choices. She could fall apart, or she could stand up. She stood up. She stood up the way a person stands up after being hit by something, slowly, uncertainly, with one hand braced against the wall and her legs unsure beneath her. She applied for every assistance program she could find. WAIS, SNAP, Medicaid, childcare subsidies. She sat in government offices with Wren in a carrier on her chest and filled out forms and provided documentation and answered questions from social workers who were kind but overwhelmed and who processed her case alongside hundreds of others. She got a job at a diner on Bleecker Street called Rosie's, 6-hour shifts, saw 4 days a week, breakfast and lunch service. The owner, a woman named Patrice, who was 61 and had run the place alone since her husband died in 2012, let Maren bring Wren during slow hours and set up a portable crib in the back office beside the filing cabinets and the cases of ketchup. Patrice didn't ask questions. She didn't offer opinions on Maren's situation. She said, "You work hard, you show up on time, we'll get along fine." And Maren worked hard. She showed up on time. She poured coffee and took orders and wiped down tables and smiled at customers who didn't see her, who looked through her the way people look through anyone in a uniform, as if the apron made her part of the furniture. And she took her tips home in a mason jar and counted them on the kitchen floor after Ren was asleep. $31 on a good day, $14 on a bad one. She kept a notebook. She tracked every dollar. She paid rent. She paid utilities. She bought formula and diapers and the cheap onesies from the clearance bin at Walmart, and at the end of every month, after everything was paid, she had somewhere between $40 and $90 left over, and she put it in an envelope in her sock drawer, and she did not touch it, because that envelope was the difference between surviving and not surviving. And she knew with the clarity of someone who has seen the edge, that the margin was that thin. The months passed. Spring came and went. Summer arrived, humid and thick, and Ren learned to sit up, and then to crawl, and then to pull herself to standing, holding onto the couch cushions with both hands, her dark eyes wide with the astonishment of verticality. Maren watched her daughter discover the world in a 900-square-foot apartment, and felt two things simultaneously: a joy so sharp it was almost pain, and a dull, persistent ache that this was all she could give her. No yard, no family dinners, no grandparents, no one to call when Ren had a fever at 2 a.m., and Maren didn't know if it was high enough for the emergency room. She called the nurse hotline instead. She called it 11 times in Ren's first year. She memorized the prompts. She could navigate the phone tree in her sleep. She became, out of pure necessity, competent in ways she never would have chosen. She learned to fix a leaking faucet from a YouTube video at midnight. She learned to unclog a drain with baking soda and vinegar. After she learned which thrift stores had the best children's clothes, and which churches gave out free diapers on the first Saturday of the month, and which food pantry had actual vegetables instead of just canned corn and pasta. She learned the geography of survival, and she moved through it with the efficiency of someone who could not afford a single wasted mile. Tyler called in August, her brother. She hadn't heard from him in almost 3 years. He was living in northern Vermont now, he said, up near a town called Elmore, working as a logger for a small outfit that cut hardwood for specialty mills. He'd gotten married. His wife's name was Dana. They had a small place, not much, he said, just a cabin on 12 acres that Dana's grandfather had left her. He sounded different, older, less like someone running away and more like someone who had found the place he'd been running toward. He said, "I heard about Jesse. I heard about Mom." "I'm sorry, Maren," she said. "How did you hear?" He said, "I called the house. Mom told me. She told me you'd gotten what you deserved." Maren closed her eyes. Even now, even secondhand, even filtered through her brother's voice, the words landed like a hand on a bruise. Tyler said, "Come up here. Come stay with us for a while. Bring Ren. Dana wants to meet you both. There's room. It's quiet. You can figure things out." Maren said she'd think about it. She said she had a job and a lease and a system, and she wasn't sure she could just leave. But the truth was something simpler and harder than logistics. The truth was that she was afraid to trust someone again, afraid to need someone. So yet afraid to arrive at another person's door and discover that what they were offering had conditions she couldn't see yet. She'd been burned by need. She'd been burned by the belief that someone would catch her. She had learned, at great cost, to carry her own weight, and the prospect of leaning on anyone, even her brother, even family, triggered something in her chest that felt like vertigo, a swooping emptiness where solid ground should have been. September came. The weather shifted. Maren's lease was up at the end of October, and her landlord told her the rent was going up $175 a month. She did the math. She did the math 3 times, sitting on the kitchen floor with her notebook and a calculator she'd bought for $4 at a yard sale, and every time the numbers came out the same, she couldn't afford it. Not with her diner income. Not with assistance. Not with the money in the envelope. She could find a cheaper place, but cheaper in Utica meant smaller, darker, worse neighborhoods, further from Rosie's, further from the clinic, or she could leave. She called Tyler back. She said, "Is the office still open?" He said, "The door's always open, Maren. Always." She gave Patrice 2 weeks' notice. Patrice hugged her, the first time she'd ever done that, and pressed a sealed envelope into her hand and said, "Don't open it until you're on the road." Maren opened it in the parking lot of the diner, sitting in the Subaru with Ren asleep in the car seat behind her. Inside was $400 in 20s and a note in Patrice's handwriting that said, "You're the hardest worker I've ever had. Take care of that baby. Come back and see me." Maren sat there and cried. So she cried the way she hadn't allowed herself to cry since Jesse left, fully, ugly, with her forehead against the steering wheel and her shoulders shaking and the sound of it filling the car, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. And then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and she started the engine and she drove. The drive from Utica to Elmore, Vermont should have taken 4.5 hours. Maren left at noon on November 19th. The forecast said snow, but the forecast in November in the Northeast always said snow, and the forecast said 2 to 4 inches, which was nothing, which was a dusting, which was Tuesday. She drove east on Route 5 and then north, climbing into the mountains, watching the sky change color as the elevation rose, from gray to white to a dense, luminous silver that seemed to press down against the tree line like a ceiling being lowered. By 2 p.m., the snow was falling. By 2:30, it was falling hard. By 3 p.m., the road was covered and the visibility was down to 50 feet, and the Subaru's windshield wipers were losing their war with the accumulation, pushing heavy wet snow to the sides where it built up in ridges that narrowed her view to a shrinking rectangle. She should have pulled over. She knew that. She should have found a gas station or a parking lot or a wide spot in the road and waited it out. But she was an hour from Tyler's place, and Ren was starting to fuss in the back seat, and the formula was almost gone. And there was a part of Maren, the part that had been forged in that apartment, alone, counting dollars on the floor, that could not bring herself to stop moving forward because forward was the only direction that had ever gotten her anywhere. Route 9 climbed. The road narrowed. The trees closed in on both sides, their branches heavy with snow, creating a tunnel of white that swallowed the headlights. And then the car hit something, a patch of ice, a drift, something she never saw. And the steering wheel went light in her hands, and the rear end swung out to the right, and the Subaru slid sideways off the road and into the ditch with a sound like a gasp, like the car itself was surprised, and then everything was still except the engine, which ran for another 15 seconds and then coughed and died. Ren was screaming. Maren turned in her seat, her hands shaking, and checked. No blood, no injury, the car seat had held, and the baby was frightened but safe. Safe for now. The car was tilted at an angle in the ditch, the driver's side lower than the passenger side, snow already accumulating on the windshield. Maren tried the engine. Nothing. She tried again. A clicking sound, then nothing. The heater was gone. The temperature outside, according to the last reading before the dash went dark, was 9 degrees. 9 degrees. She had maybe 20 minutes before the cold became dangerous. Maybe 30 if she wrapped Ren in every piece of clothing in the diaper bag. She pulled out her phone. No signal. She held it up, moved it around, tried by the window, tried by the roof. Nothing. Not a single bar. She was alone on a mountain road in a blizzard with a baby and no way to call for help. And the cold was already coming through the doors, through the windows, or through the metal frame of the car, patient and absolute, the kind of cold that doesn't negotiate. She made a decision. She made it in about 4 seconds, which was all the time she could afford. She was going to walk. She was going to take Ren in the diaper bag and walk until she found a house or a road crew or another car or anything. She knew it was dangerous. She knew it might be the wrong choice. But staying in the car was dying, slowly and certainly. And Maren Hollis had decided a long time ago, on a kitchen floor in Utica counting dimes, that she would not die quietly. She would not die without moving. She unzipped her coat, a secondhand North Face she'd bought at Goodwill for $12, and she lifted Ren out of the car seat and placed her against her bare chest, inside her shirt, and then zipped the coat over both of them. Arched the baby's head just below her chin, and she could feel Ren's heartbeat against her own, rapid and small, a bird's heart. And she said, out loud, into the snow and the silence, "We're going to be okay. I'm going to find us somewhere warm." And she started walking. The world was white. Not white the way a wall is white or a page is white. White the way blindness is white. White the way absence is white. a total obliteration of shape and distance and direction. The snow was past her knees. Each step required her to lift her leg high and push forward and plant her foot and hope that what was underneath was still the road and not the edge of something worse. She couldn't see more than 15 feet in any direction. The wind was steady, not gusting, see just a constant pressure from the north that drove the snow horizontally against her face and froze the moisture on her eyelashes and worked its way through the seams of her coat with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. She kept her left arm wrapped around Ren inside the coat and her right arm extended in front of her, fingers spread, as if she could feel her way through the storm by touch. She counted her steps. She'd read somewhere, or maybe she'd seen it on television. That counting helped, that it kept your mind working, kept the cold from lulling you into the kind of sleepy compliance that preceded death. She counted to 100 and started over. She did this 4 times, 400 steps. She had no idea how far that was. Maybe a quarter mile, maybe less. The snow was deeper now, see up past her thighs in the drifts, and she was sweating inside her coat despite the cold, her body burning fuel it didn't have, and Ren was quiet, too quiet, not crying, not moving, just breathing against Marin's chest in soft little puffs that were getting further apart, and Marin tightened her arm around her daughter and said, stay with me, baby, we're almost there," even though she had no idea where there was. And then she saw it. A shape, darker than the snow, angular where the snow was curved. She stopped walking and blinked and wiped the ice from her eyes with the back of her wrist and looked again, and it was still there. A structure, a building, a cabin, set back from the road maybe 40 feet, half buried in snow, shit with a roof that sagged under the weight of the accumulation and a chimney that rose from the left side like a finger pointed at the sky. And from that chimney, smoke. Smoke rising into the storm, torn apart by the wind almost immediately but unmistakable. Gray against white, warm against cold, life against everything else. There was a door. Dark wood, maybe oak, with a metal latch. Marin staggered toward it. She climbed what she guessed were porch steps, though they were invisible under the snow, and she reached the door and she tried to raise her right hand to knock and she couldn't. Her hand was a claw. Her fingers were white and rigid and past the point of voluntary movement. She leaned into the door with her left shoulder, the shoulder that wasn't holding her daughter, and she pushed, and the latch gave, and the door opened inward. Iron and heat poured out. The cabin was small. One main room, maybe 16 by 20 feet, with a fieldstone fireplace on the far wall where a fire was burning. Not smoldering, not dying, but burning, fully, with real logs stacked in a proper arrangement, the kind of fire built by someone who knew what they were doing. There was a wooden table with 2 chairs, a kitchen area against the right wall, a sink, a small propane stove, open shelves with canned goods and jars, a narrow doorway leading to what might have been a bedroom, braided rag rugs on a plank floor, a kerosene lamp on the table, lit, casting a warm amber circle of light that made the whole room glow like the inside of a lantern, and rising from a rocking chair beside the fire, a woman. She was old, not elderly, not frail, old in the way mountains are old, now in the way stone is old, worn smooth by time but fundamentally solid. She might have been 70, she might have been 80. She had white hair pulled back in a braid that hung past her shoulder blades, and a face that was all lines and angles, sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw and eyes that were startlingly light, gray or blue or something between the two, and she was looking at Marin with an expression that held no surprise. None. No shock at a half-frozen woman stumbling through her door with a baby inside her coat in the middle of a blizzard. She looked at Marin the way you look at someone you've been expecting. "Close the door," she said. Her voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that doesn't waste words. Marin pushed the door shut with her back and stood there, swaying, dripping, so her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. The woman was already moving. She crossed the room with a speed that contradicted her age and took Marin by the arm, not gently, not roughly, but firmly with purpose, and guided her to the rocking chair. "Sit down," she said. "Let me see the baby." Marin shook her head. She tightened her arm around Ren. It was instinct, not distrust, the same instinct that had carried her through the snow, the animal refusal to let go of the thing she was protecting. The woman knelt in front of her. She put both hands on Marin's knees and looked up at her and said, very quietly, "You found me. She's safe now. You're both safe. Let me help." And something in the way she said it, the certainty, the calm, or the absolute absence of performance, broke through the wall of ice and adrenaline that Marin had built around herself, and she unzipped her coat and she let the woman take her daughter. The woman's name was Eudora Vance. She told Marin this later, after she'd wrapped Ren in a wool blanket that smelled like cedar and wood smoke and placed her in a basket near the fire. Not a baby basket, just a large woven basket that had probably held apples or potatoes lined with a folded quilt. After she'd pulled Marin's boots off her feet and examined her toes, which were white but not grey, and wrapped her feet in warmed cloth. After she'd made her drink a cup of broth from a pot that was already simmering on the stove, chicken broth with onion and thyme, hot enough to hurt going down but good, so good that Marin's eyes welled up at the taste. I say because it was the first thing anyone had made for her in as long as she could remember. "My name is Eudora," she said, settling into a straight-back chair across from Marin with her own cup of broth. "Most people call me Dory, but I've never been most people, so you can call me Eudora." There was no phone in the cabin, no electricity, no television. The water came from a well with a hand pump in the kitchen. The heat came from the fire and a small wood stove in the bedroom. Eudora had lived here for 31 years, she said, since her husband Bernard died, and her children, 2 sons, both in Connecticut, decided that the proper thing to do with their mother was to worry about her from a distance without actually visiting. She said this without bitterness. She said it the way someone describes the weather. Factually, certain with a slight adjustment of expectations. "They call at Christmas," she said. "They mean well. They just don't mean enough." The blizzard lasted 2 days. 2 full days of wind that screamed around the cabin like something alive, and snow that piled against the windows until the light coming through was blue-white and diffuse, like being inside an egg. Marin and Ren stayed. They had no choice, and even if they'd had a choice, Marin would have stayed, because something was happening in that cabin that she didn't have a name for yet, something she would later recognize as the slow, painful process of being seen. Eudora did not ask her why she was driving alone with a baby in a blizzard. She did not ask where the baby's father was. She did not ask about Marin's family. She asked what Ren liked to eat. She asked if Marin had any allergies. So she asked, on the second morning, while Marin was nursing Ren in the rocking chair, whether Marin had been sleeping at all, and when Marin said she hadn't, not really, not in months, Eudora nodded and said, "Then sleep now. I'll watch her." And Marin, who had not let another person hold her daughter for more than 5 minutes since Jessie left, who had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours since Ren was born, who had trained herself to wake at the slightest sound because there was no one to take the next shift. Marin looked at this woman she had known for less than 24 hours, this stranger in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and she felt something she had not felt since she was a child falling asleep in her father's truck on the way home from the gravel pit. She felt safe. She went to the bedroom and lay down on Eudora's bed, which was narrow and hard and covered with quilts that weighed as much as a person, and she slept for 9 hours. She slept without dreams. She slept the way you sleep when your body finally believes that no one is going to take anything from you while your eyes are closed. When she woke, it was dark outside, and she could hear Eudora in the main room, talking to Ren. Not baby talk, not cooing or singing, or the high-pitched nonsense that people direct at infants. Eudora was talking to Ren the way you talk to another adult, calmly, conversationally, with the expectation of being understood. She was telling her about the cabin, about how Bernard had built it in 1963 with wood he'd cut himself from the surrounding forest, about how the fireplace stones had come from the creek that ran behind the property, carried up the hill one at a time in a wheelbarrow, about how the first winter they'd spent here, the wind had found every gap in the walls, and they'd stuffed the cracks with newspaper and wool and Bernard's old shirts, and he'd laughed and said, "This house is more patches than house, Dory, but it keeps the weather honest." Marin stood in the doorway of the bedroom and listened. Ren was on Eudora's lap, looking up at her face with the grave, unblinking attention that only babies can sustain, and Eudora was holding her with the practiced ease of a woman who had held many children, her hands sure and wide and steady, and the firelight was turning everything amber and gold. Yet, and for a moment, Maren saw something she hadn't seen in a very long time. A picture of what it looked like when a child was held by someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to take and nowhere else to be. It looked like love. Not the love she'd grown up with, which was conditional and small and always in danger of being withdrawn. Not the love Jessie had offered, which was warm and convincing and ultimately hollow. Something else. Something that existed without requiring anything in return. She didn't have a word for it then. She would find the word later. On the third morning, the storm broke. The silence was enormous, not an absence of sound but a presence, a thick, heavy quiet that pressed against the windows and filled the rooms and made every small noise, the creak of a floorboard, the pop of the fire, or Ren's breathing, seem amplified and significant. Eudora opened the front door, and the light that poured in was blinding. The world was buried. The snow was waist-deep in the clearing around the cabin and drifted higher against the trees, and the sky was a blue so deep and clean that it looked fake, like something painted by someone who had never seen a real sky and was just guessing. Maren stood beside Eudora in the doorway and looked out at the white expanse and felt two things at the same time. The urgency to get to Tyler, to let him know she was alive, to continue the journey she'd started, and a strange, aching reluctance to leave this place. This warm, small, improbable place where she had been found. She said, "I need to call my brother. He's expecting me. He'll be worried." Eudora said, "There's a phone at the Bartons farm, on about 3 miles down. When the plow comes through, I'll walk you to the road." Maren said, "You don't have to walk me anywhere." Eudora looked at her. She had a way of looking that was like a hand on your shoulder, steady, present, impossible to ignore. She said, "I know I don't have to. I want to. There's a difference, and I'd like you to start learning it." The plow came through that afternoon. They heard it before they saw it, a grinding mechanical roar that split the silence like an axe through wood, and Maren packed the diaper bag and bundled Ren and stood by the door, ready, the same way she was always ready, always packed, always prepared for the next departure, because departure was what she knew. Eudora handed her a paper bag. Inside was food, bread she'd baked that morning, a jar of preserved peaches, as a block of cheese wrapped in cloth, a bag of dried apple slices, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of flannel, a small wooden bird. Hand-carved, unpainted, about the size of Maren's palm. The detail was extraordinary. Each feather was individually defined, the head was turned slightly to the side, one eye visible, alert and alive. Eudora said, "Bernard made that. Years ago. He was a carver. He made hundreds of them. Sold them at the craft fair in Stowe." She paused. "This one was always my favorite," she said. "It's a wren." Maren looked at the bird. She looked at Eudora. "I can't take this," she said. "You can," Eudora said, "and you will, because I want you to have something in your hands when things get heavy. Something that reminds you that someone made something beautiful and put it in the world for no reason except that they could." So Tyler picked them up at the Bartons farm. He drove up in a battered Ford with Dana in the passenger seat, a small woman with red hair and freckles and a smile that was shy but genuine, the kind of smile that comes from someone who is quietly good and doesn't need you to notice. Tyler looked at Maren through the truck window for a long moment before getting out. He was bigger than she remembered, broader. His face was weathered in a way that made him look like their father, and when he hugged her, carefully because of Ren, she felt the same solidity, the same quiet steadiness. And she thought, "You got out. You got out, and you found something real." They drove to the cabin on the 12 acres. It was small, smaller than Maren's apartment in Utica, but it was warm and clean, and there were curtains in the windows and a dog on the porch and a garden bed, dormant now under the snow, that Dana said produced tomatoes and beans and squash in the summer. The guest room was barely larger than a closet, but Tyler had built a crib for Ren. He'd built it himself from pine and sanded it smooth, and when Maren saw it, the careful dovetail joints, the hand-rubbed finish, the effort and the intention of it, She understood that her brother had been preparing for her arrival in ways she hadn't imagined, that he had wanted her to come, that he had been waiting. She stayed. She stayed a week, and then a month, and then the month became winter, and winter became a kind of life. Tyler went to work in the mornings, on his truck crunching down the frozen dirt road in the dark, and Dana and Maren moved through the days together, feeding Ren, cooking, cleaning, the quiet domestic choreography of two women learning to share a kitchen. Dana was easy to be around. She didn't fill silence with noise, she didn't push. She left space for Maren to be however she needed to be, and Maren, slowly, uncertainly, like a plant turning toward a light source it doesn't fully trust, began to unfold. She told Dana things, not everything, not the worst of it, but pieces. About Jessie, about her mother, about the apartment and the diner and the mason jar on the kitchen floor. Dana listened. She didn't offer advice. She didn't say, "Oh, honey," or "you poor thing," on it, or any of the things people say when they want to feel compassionate without actually sitting in the discomfort of someone else's pain. She said, "That must have been so hard." She said, "I'm glad you're here." She said, "Ren is lucky to have you." Simple things. True things. Things that cost nothing to say and were worth more than Maren could calculate. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the snow was pulling back from the edges of the clearing, and the creek behind Tyler's property was running again, fast and loud and swollen with meltwater. Maren got a job, a real one, not a stopgap, not a survival measure, but a job with a future. The Elmore Community Health Center, a small clinic that served 3 towns, was looking for a medical billing specialist. Maren's incomplete community college coursework, on which she had assumed was worthless, turned out to be exactly what they needed. She applied on a Tuesday, interviewed on a Thursday, and started the following Monday at $17.50 an hour, which was more money than she had ever made. She sat in the parking lot of the clinic on her first day and did the math in her notebook, $17.50 times 40 hours times 52 weeks, and the number that came out was $36,400. And she stared at it and felt something she had never felt before, a sensation so unfamiliar it took her several minutes to identify. It was security, not wealth, not comfort, just the knowledge that if nothing went wrong, she could pay rent and buy food and put diapers on her daughter and have money left over. That the margin was no longer razor thin. That there was room, however small, for a mistake, for a surprise, if for the kind of ordinary emergency, a flat tire, a doctor's visit, a broken window, that had previously been catastrophic. She put the notebook in the glove compartment and she sat there for another minute, and then she went inside and started her new life. She went back to see Eudora. She went back the first weekend she had a day off, driving the mountain road that had nearly killed her 5 months earlier, now green and wet and impossibly lush, the trees exploding with the desperate optimism of a Vermont spring. She found the cabin. She found the turnoff she hadn't been able to see in the storm, a narrow dirt track that branched off Route 9 and climbed through birch and maple for a quarter mile to the clearing where the cabin sat, smaller than she remembered, older, the roof patched in 3 places with mismatched shingles, so the porch sagging on the left side, the whole structure leaning slightly eastward as if it were tired. But the chimney was straight, and the windows were clean, and there were daffodils growing along the foundation, bright yellow against the dark wood, and when Maren knocked, Eudora opened the door with the same expression she'd worn on the night of the blizzard. Unsurprised, steady, present. "You came back," Eudora said. Maren said, "I told you I would." Eudora looked at her. "You did," she said, "but a lot of people say that." Maren held up the wooden bird, the wren, which she had kept on the windowsill of the guest room at Tyler's cabin, where it caught the morning light. She said, "You gave me something. The least I can do is come back and tell you it matters." She kept going back. Every week, then every other week, then at least once a month, and she drove up the mountain to Eudora's cabin with Ren in the car seat and groceries in the trunk. She brought canned goods and fresh bread and milk and the dark chocolate that Eudora pretended she didn't care about, but always ate first. She brought firewood when the stack ran low. She brought a new set of towels when she noticed Eudora's were threadbare. She brought Ren, who was walking now, toddling around the cabin with her arms out for balance, pulling books off the lowest shelf and carrying them to Eudora with the solemn intensity of a child delivering important documents. Eudora read to her. She read to her from books that were far too advanced. Thoreau, Frost, and a battered copy of The Old Man and the Sea that had Bernard's name written on the inside cover in pencil. And Wren sat on her lap and listened with the same grave attention she'd shown as an infant, and Eudora said, "This child understands more than you think. They all do. We just stop listening because it's easier than hearing what they know." Maren asked Eudora once about her sons, the ones in Connecticut. Eudora was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "They're good men. They provide, they remember birthdays, they send checks I don't cash, but they don't come. They haven't been here in," she paused, counting, 11 years. The older one, Martin, he came when the well needed fixing. The younger one, George, he came when I had pneumonia. They come for problems. They don't come for me. And she said this with the same factual calm she said everything, but Maren heard something underneath it, not self-pity, not anger, but a weariness with the pretense of connection. The phone calls that said, "I care," without meaning I'm here. The checks that said "I love you" without meaning I know you. Maren recognized it. She recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection in a window. Suddenly, unexpectedly, with a small shock of familiarity. Wren turned 2, then 3. Maren got a raise, then another. She completed her certification online, studying at the kitchen table after Wren was asleep, and her salary went up to $22 an hour. She rented a small house on the edge of Elmore, 2 bedrooms, a yard, a maple tree that turned impossible colors in October. She painted Wren's room yellow. She bought a used couch. She hung the wooden bird on a shelf in the kitchen where she could see it every morning. She was building a life. Not the life she had imagined at 19, not the life her mother had modeled, not the life Jesse had promised and abandoned. Something else. Something constructed from scratch, from the raw materials of her own stubbornness and Patrice's $400 and Tyler's pine crib and Dana's quiet companionship and Eudora's broth and wool blankets and the bird that Bernard Vance had carved from a piece of cherry wood 50 years ago in a cabin on a mountain. She was lonely sometimes. She was tired most of the time. She still counted dollars in a notebook. She still woke at 2 a.m. to check the locks. She still flinched when the phone rang because somewhere in her nervous system, phone calls were still associated with bad news. Jesse's silence, her mother's cruelty, the absence of the voices that should have been there. But she was okay. She was more than okay. She was standing on her own 2 feet in a house she paid for with money she earned, raising a daughter who was healthy and curious and kind, and if that doesn't sound like much, then you've never had to build it from nothing. Wren was 3.5 when she asked the question. They were driving home from Eudora's cabin on a Sunday afternoon in September, the car windows down, the air smelling like fallen leaves and cold water, and Wren was in the back seat looking at a picture book Eudora had given her, and she said, "Mama, how come Dory doesn't have a family?" Maren looked at her in the rearview mirror. "She does have a family, sweetheart. She has sons. B, they live far away." Wren considered this, "But nobody comes to see her," she said. "Just us." Maren didn't answer right away. She drove. She watched the road wind through the trees, the light coming through the canopy in shifting patterns. After a while, Wren said, "Is she lonely?" And Maren said, "I think she used to be." And Wren said, "She's not lonely anymore because we come. Right?" And Maren said, "Right." And Wren said, "Good," and went back to her book, and Maren drove the rest of the way home with a tightness in her throat that wasn't sadness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that her 3-year-old daughter had just articulated, in 12 words, the entire moral architecture of what it meant to show up for someone. Not to call, not to send a check, not to worry from a distance, but to come. To keep coming. See, to walk through the door and sit down and stay. The call came on a Tuesday in October. Maren was at work, at the clinic, processing insurance claims at her desk, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. A Vermont number. She answered, and a voice she didn't know said, "Is this Maren Hollis?" "Yes," she said. The voice said, My name is Clara Barton. No relation, she added, which Maren would later realize was the kind of joke a person makes when they've made it 1,000 times. And I'm a home health aide with Green Mountain Elder Services. I've been checking in on Mrs. Vance. She paused. Eudora fell this morning. She fell getting wood from the pile. She's at Copley Hospital in Morrisville. She's stable, but she broke her hip. She's asking for you. Maren left work. She drove to the hospital. When she walked into the room and found Eudora in a bed that looked wrong for her. Too white, too institutional, too horizontal for a woman who was always vertical, always upright, always in motion. She was wearing a hospital gown, and her braid was undone, and her hair was spread across the pillow like white silk, and she looked smaller than Maren had ever seen her, diminished by the fluorescent light and the beeping machines and the indignity of being somewhere she didn't choose to be. She opened her eyes when Maren sat down beside the bed. You came, she said. Maren said, Of course I came. Eudora said, The doctors say I need surgery, a pin in the hip, then rehabilitation. Weeks of it. Maybe months. She paused. They want to send me to a facility. Maren said, What do you want? Eudora looked at her with those grey-blue eyes, and for the first time since Maren had known her, there was something vulnerable in them. Not fear, not weakness, but the quiet terror of a person who has maintained their independence for 31 years and is now facing the possibility of losing it. I want to go home, she said. I want to die in that cabin. I don't mean today. I'm not being dramatic. But when the time comes, I want to be in Bernard's house. I want to see the fire and hear the creak and feel the floor he built under my feet. Maren took her hand. She took Eudora's hand, long-fingered, strong even now, calloused from decades of cutting wood and pumping water and carving birds, and she held it and she said, Then that's what we'll do. I'll take care of it. And Eudora, who had not cried when Bernard died, who had not cried when her sons stopped coming, one who had not cried when a stranger fell through her door in a blizzard with a baby, Eudora closed her eyes and let out a breath that seemed to carry decades of held weight, and she didn't cry, not exactly, but something released in her face, a tension that Maren had never noticed because it had always been there, and in its absence, she looked younger, softer, like a version of herself from a time before she'd had to be so strong. Maren made phone calls, she talked to the doctors, she talked to the insurance company, she talked to the rehabilitation center, she talked to Tyler and Dana. She talked to Clara Barton, the home health aide. She constructed a plan with the same meticulous, stubborn efficiency she'd used to survive on $14 a day in Utica, except now she had more tools, more resources, more people. And Tyler and Dana agreed to take Ren during the days Maren couldn't. Clara agreed to increase her visits to the cabin. Maren arranged for Eudora's discharge after surgery and a 3-week rehab stint, and she drove to the cabin and she spent a weekend making it ready, installing grab bars in the bathroom, building a ramp over the porch steps, moving the bed from the bedroom to the main room so Eudora could be near the fire, stocking the shelves with enough food for a month. She did these things with the quiet intensity of someone repaying a debt that was never owed, because Eudora had never asked for anything. She had never said, "You owe me." She had never said, "I saved your life, so now you save mine." She had simply opened a door and let a stranger in from the cold. And whatever happened after that was just people being decent to each other, which was, Eudora would have said, the most ordinary thing in the world, and also the rarest. Eudora came home on a Wednesday in November. Maren drove her. She helped her out of the car and up the ramp and through the door, and Eudora stood in the main room of her cabin and looked at the fire Maren had lit that morning. Because the fire was already burning when Eudora walked in, the way it had been burning when Maren walked in 2 years before. And she said, "Oh, just that. Oh." And she put her hand on the back of the rocking chair and lowered herself into it and closed her eyes and breathed. And the sound she made was the sound of someone arriving in the only place they've ever fully belonged. Ren came to visit the next day. And she brought a drawing, crayon on construction paper, a brown rectangle with a triangle on top, and a gray line rising from it with scribbles at the end. "This is your house," she said, "and this is the smoke. And these," she pointed at 2 stick figures in the doorway, "are you and me." Eudora held the drawing at arm's length because her near vision wasn't what it used to be, and she studied it with the seriousness of a museum curator examining a masterpiece. And she said, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever been given." Ren beamed. Maren watched them from across the room and felt the tightness in her throat again, the sweet ache of witnessing something holy in its ordinariness. The recovery was slow. Eudora was not a good patient. She was impatient, stubborn, furious at her own limitations. She hated the walker. She hated the exercises. She hated being helped out of bed in the morning by a woman she had been helping only weeks before. But she did the exercises. She used the walker. She let Maren help her. And slowly, week by week, she improved. By January, she was walking with a cane. By February, she was in the kitchen making broth. By March, when the snow began to pull back and the daffodils pushed up through the mud around the foundation, she was outside, standing in the clearing, looking at the mountains with a cup of tea in her hands and a color in her cheeks that Maren hadn't seen before. Not just health, but something beyond health. Something that looked like gratitude turned outward, like a woman seeing the world she'd almost left and deciding it was worth staying in. Martin called. Eudora's older son. He called on a Sunday in April. Oint and Eudora put him on speakerphone, not intentionally, but because she pressed the wrong button and Maren was in the kitchen and heard the whole conversation. Martin's voice was pleasant and businesslike, the voice of a man who managed situations rather than inhabiting them. He asked about her hip. He asked about her medications. He asked whether she'd considered selling the cabin and moving to an assisted living community near him in Westport, Connecticut, where there were excellent facilities and she'd be closer to the grandchildren. He said the word facilities the way you'd say amenities, like it was a selling point. Eudora listened. She let him finish. Then she said, "Martin, when was the last time you were here?" He was quiet. She said, "I'll tell you. It was 2015. You came to fix the well pump. You stayed 2 days. Your children have never been inside this house." She paused. "I broke my hip 5 months ago, and a woman I met in a snowstorm took care of me. She brought her daughter. That little girl drew me a picture that's hanging on my wall right now. Your children have not drawn me a picture. They have not sat on this floor. They have not heard not sat on this floor. They have not heard the creak or seen the fire or touched the stones your father carried up the hill." Martin started to speak. Eudora said, "I'm not angry. I've been angry, and I'm finished with it. I'm telling you what's true. You love me in the way that's convenient for you. This girl, Maren, she loves me in the way that costs something. And I want you to know the difference. Because when I die, Martin, and I will die, probably in this chair, probably looking at this fire, I want you to know who was here." The line was quiet for a long time. Then Martin said, "Mom, and his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to hear the fault line running through it, the place where his composure met something raw and unresolved. Eudora said, "You don't have to say anything right now, just think about it. Come when you're ready. But come because you want to, not because you feel guilty. Guilt is a terrible reason to do anything." She hung up. Maren stood in the kitchen with her hands on the counter and didn't move. She was thinking about her own mother, about the phone call, about the 8 words. "You made your bed, Maren. You lie in it." She was thinking about the distance between that sentence and what Eudora had just said to her son, the vast, unbridgeable gulf between a mother who punishes and a mother who invites, on between a door closed and a door opened, between "I told you so" and "come when you're ready." She was thinking about which kind of mother she wanted to be. Martin came. He came in June with his wife and his 2 children, a boy of 12 and a girl of 9, and they drove up the dirt track in a silver BMW that looked absurd on the rutted path and parked in the clearing and got out and stood there looking at the cabin, the way tourists look at historical sites, with a mixture of interest and mild disbelief that people actually live this way. But they came inside. They sat down. The boy, whose name was Thomas, spent 2 hours at the creek catching salamanders and came back to the cabin with mud on his pants and an expression of bewildered delight, as if he'd discovered a world that existed outside of screens. The girl, Elise, found Eudora's collection of Bernard's carved birds. There were still dozens of them on a shelf in the bedroom, each one different, each one perfect, and she held them one by one and asked about each species, and Eudora named them all from memory. Pine siskin, hermit thrush, cedar waxwing, blackpoll warbler. The names fell from her lips like music, like a litany, like a prayer she'd been saying alone for years that finally had a congregation. Martin sat at the kitchen table and watched his mother with his children, and Maren saw his face change. Not dramatically, not with tears or confession, but with a slow, dawning recognition, the way dawn itself works. Not a switch, but a gradient. Darkness becoming gray, becoming light, becoming color. He looked at Maren across the room. He said, "Thank you for taking care of her." Maren said, "So she took care of me first." He nodded. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. Some debts are legible in the way a person stands, the way they move through a space, the way they touch a doorframe on their way out, as if they're thanking the house for existing. George came later, the younger son. He came in August, alone, and he stayed 3 days, and he fixed the porch. Not because Eudora asked, not because it was dangerous, but because it was sagging, and he could see that it was sagging, and he had the tools and the lumber and the time, and for 3 days he knelt on the ground in the Vermont sun and leveled the supports and replaced the boards and sanded the railing until it was smooth, and Eudora sat in the rocking chair that Maren had moved to the porch and watched him work and said nothing. And the silence between them was not the silence of estrangement, but the silence of two people who were slowly, carefully, finding their way back to each other across a distance that years of neglect had widened into a chasm. On the last night, George sat beside his mother on the porch and said, "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner." Eudora said, "You're here now." He said, "Is that enough?" She said, "It's a start." And then she put her hand on his arm, and they sat there watching the sun go down behind the mountains, and the light was gold and red and amber, and the creek was running, and the fire inside was low but steady, and the world, for a moment, was exactly as large as it needed to be. Wren turned 4 in October. Maren threw a party at the house in Elmore, the first real party she'd ever organized. So with balloons and a cake, she made herself from a recipe she found online, chocolate with buttercream frosting that wasn't quite level, but was covered in sprinkles that Wren had chosen herself, every color at once. Tyler and Dana came. Clara Barton, the home health aide, came. Patrice drove up from Utica, 5 hours, and walked through the door and looked at Maren and said, "Look at you." And Maren hugged her the way you hug someone who gave you $400 when you had nothing, which is to say completely, without reservation, with both arms and your whole body and the full weight of what their generosity made possible. And Eudora came. Tyler drove up the mountain and brought her down in his truck. And she walked into Maren's house with her cane and her braid and her sharp blue-gray eyes, and she looked at the yellow kitchen and the wooden bird on the shelf, and the child's drawings taped to the refrigerator, and the table set for 8, and she said, "Well, Maren, you've built something." Maren said, "I had help." Eudora said, "Everyone has help. The question is whether you're brave enough to let them." Wren ran to Eudora and hugged her legs and said, Dory, it's my birthday. I'm 4. And Eudora said, "I know you are, and I brought you something." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package, and Wren tore it open with the savage efficiency of a 4-year-old, and inside was a carved bird. A wren, smaller than the one she'd given Maren, more delicate, seen with its wings slightly spread as if caught in the moment before flight. "This one Bernard made for a child," Eudora said. "You can tell because of the wings. He always gave the children's birds open wings. He said children should know they were made to fly." Wren held the bird in both hands and looked at it and said, "It's like Mama's." And Eudora said, "Yes, it is. And now you match." Maren never called her mother. She thought about it. She thought about it more than she wanted to admit. In the quiet hours, in the dark, in the moments between sleep and waking, when the walls she'd built during the day grew thin and permeable, and the old ache leaked through. She thought about dialing the number and hearing Connie's voice and saying, "What? What would she say? I survived? I'm okay? You were wrong about me?" She didn't know what she wanted from the conversation. She didn't know if she wanted an apology or an explanation, or simply the sound of her mother's voice saying her name the way mothers are supposed to say their children's names, with warmth, with claim, with the implicit promise that being known is the same as being loved. She talked to Eudora about it. Eudora said forgiveness isn't a phone call. It's not something you deliver, it's something you build inside yourself, board by board, like a house. And some days the house holds, and some days the wind gets in, and you repair it, and you keep going. She said, you don't owe your mother a phone call, you don't owe her forgiveness, you don't owe her anything. But if you decide to call, if you decide, not guilt, not obligation, or not some idea of what a good daughter is supposed to do, if you decide, then do it for yourself, not for her. Maren said, I don't know if I'm ready. Eudora said, that's fine. Ready isn't a deadline, it's a direction. You'll know when you get there, or you won't. Either way, you'll be okay. 2 years passed. Ren started school. She walked through the doors of Elmore Elementary on a Tuesday morning in September, wearing a backpack that was almost as big as she was, and new sneakers and the determined expression of a person embarking on a great expedition, and Maren stood on the sidewalk and watched her go, and felt the specific, piercing pride of a mother who has given her child something she never had. A normal morning, a safe school, a life that starts from solid ground instead of cracked foundation. She got promoted at the clinic, and she was the billing department now. Not a department of one, but close. With an assistant she trained herself, and a system she designed, and a reputation among the providers for accuracy and fairness, and the kind of stubbornness that insurance companies learn to respect. She was making $52,000 a year. She had a savings account. She had health insurance. She had a 401k that she contributed to every paycheck because Eudora had told her once that the only thing worse than being poor is being old and poor. And Maren had listened to that the way she listened to everything Eudora said, with the attention of someone who knows that wisdom, when it arrives, doesn't announce itself. It just sits down beside you and says something true. It was Ren who found the article. She was 6, and she was learning to read. One end she was reading everything, cereal boxes, street signs, the captions on Maren's phone, with the voracious, indiscriminate appetite of a child, discovering that the world is made of words. She was sitting on Maren's lap one evening while Maren scrolled through a local news site, and Ren pointed at the screen and said, "Mama, that says Hollis." Maren looked. It was a short article in the Utica Observer-Dispatch, dated 3 days earlier, under the heading, "Harwick Woman Dies at 62." Constance Dale Hollis, longtime resident of Harwick, New York, passed away at her home on Mead Street on October 3rd after a brief illness. She is survived by her son, Tyler Hollis, of Elmore, Vermont, and her daughter, Maren Hollis, also of Elmore. Maren read it 3 times. Or she read it the way you read something that doesn't make sense, searching for the meaning behind the words, the information the words aren't providing. Brief illness? What illness? Who was with her? Was anyone with her? Had she been alone in that house on Mead Street with the yellow linoleum and the drawn curtains and the television always on? Alone the way she'd wanted to be alone, or alone the way no one wants to be alone? Alone because everyone she'd pushed away had finally stayed away. Maren put the phone down. Ren said, "Mama, who is that?" And Maren said, "That's my mother." She said it calmly. She said it the way Eudora said things, factually, with the adjustment of expectations. Ren said, "Your mama?" And Maren said yes. And Ren said, "Is she okay?" And Maren said, "No, sweetheart. She died." Ren was quiet. Then she said, "Are you sad?" And Maren thought about it. She thought about it honestly, the way her daughter deserved, and she said, "I'm sad about a lot of things. I'm sad she didn't know you. I'm sad she didn't get to see this house and this life. I'm sad she was alone. But I'm not sad in the way you think. I'm not sad the way you'd be sad if you lost me. Because she lost me a long time ago, and she chose not to come looking." And Ren, 6 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and a gravity beyond her years, said, "That's the saddest part." Maren held her daughter. She held her close, the way she'd held her in the blizzard, inside her coat, heartbeat to heartbeat. And she thought, yes, that is the saddest part. That's exactly right. She drove to Harwick for the funeral. Tyler went with her. Dana stayed with Ren. They drove 5 hours in Tyler's truck, see mostly in silence, The kind of silence that exists between two people who shared the same childhood and don't need to narrate what they're both remembering. The house on Mead Street was exactly as Maren remembered it, and completely different. The same yellow linoleum, but buckled now, warped by years of moisture and neglect. The same curtains, but thinner, the fabric rotted by sunlight into a gauze that barely obscured the windows. The same television, unplugged, its screen covered in a film of dust. The kitchen smelled like old cooking oil and something else, something sweet and stale and organic that Maren recognized as the smell of a life lived indoors for too long, the smell of air that hasn't been exchanged. There were dishes in the sink. There were pill bottles on the counter, 6 of them, lined up in a row, between their labels curled and faded. There was a calendar on the wall, 3 months behind. And on the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a daisy, a photograph. Maren and Tyler standing in the backyard of this house. Maren maybe 8, Tyler maybe 12. They were squinting against the sun, and behind them, just visible at the edge of the frame, was a pair of hands, Connie's hands, holding the garden hose, caught in the act of watering the flowers. Not in the picture, just her hands. Just the evidence that she had been there, at the edge of the frame, doing something quiet and sustaining and invisible. Maren took the photograph. She put it in her coat pocket. She didn't take anything else. The funeral was small, 11 people, and a minister who clearly hadn't known Connie well spoke in generalities about a life of faith and perseverance. A neighbor named Mrs. Klug, who was 84 and walked with a cane, told Maren that her mother had been a difficult woman, but a reliable one. She'd brought Mrs. Klug soup once a month for the last 4 years, without being asked, without being thanked, without ever staying long enough to sit down. She just left it on the porch, Mrs. Klug said. Same soup every time. Chicken and rice. Maren stood beside the grave and looked at the casket and tried to feel something definitive, grief or anger or relief or closure, and instead she felt all of them simultaneously, none of them strong enough to drown out the others. A chord made of notes that didn't resolve. So she thought about the broth Eudora had given her on the night of the blizzard. She thought about the soup Connie had left on Mrs. Klug's porch. 2 women, 2 pots of soup, 2 completely different gestures. One offered with warmth and presence, the other left silently, without contact, without connection, just the food itself, the bare minimum of care. And Maren thought, maybe that was all her mother had. Maybe that was the most Connie Hollis was capable of giving. Not nothing. Just not enough. Not enough by a distance so vast that it might as well have been nothing. But technically, factually, slightly more than nothing. And maybe that slight more was the saddest thing of all. She went home. She went home to the house in Elmore with the yellow bedroom and the maple tree and the wooden bird on the kitchen shelf. And she went home to Wren, who ran to her at the door and grabbed her legs and said, I missed you, Mama. I missed you so much. And Maren picked her up and held her and breathed in the smell of her hair, shampoo and grass, and the particular sweetness of a child who has been running. And she thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. Not perfect, not painless, but present, real, chosen. She drove up the mountain the next day and sat with Eudora by the fire and told her everything. The house, the photograph, the soup on the porch, the 11 people at the funeral. Eudora listened. When Maren was done, Eudora was quiet for a long time. Then she said, some people love like a fire. You can see it, feel it, warm yourself by it. Other people love like a root system. Underground, invisible. Yet you never know it's there until the tree falls down and you see how deep it went. Your mother loved you underground, Maren. It wasn't enough to keep you warm, but it was there. Maren said, how do you know? Eudora said, because you turned out the way you did. Because you drive up a mountain every month to sit with an old woman in a cabin. Because you walked through a blizzard with a baby inside your coat. People who were never loved at all don't do that. They don't know how. You got something from her. Not enough, but something. And you took that something and you built the rest yourself. Maren looked at the fire. She looked at the carved birds on the shelf. She looked at this woman, this impossible, stubborn, tender woman who had opened a door on the worst night of her life and changed everything. She said, Say, I'm going to bring Ren up here for Christmas, Eudora said. I'd like that. And Martin's coming, Marin said. He called me. He asked if he could come. And George, and the grandchildren. She paused. It might be crowded. Eudora smiled. Not a big smile. Not a performative smile. A real one. Small, private, radiant, the kind of smile that transforms a face not by changing its shape, but by revealing what was always underneath. She said, "This cabin held a blizzard, Marin. It can hold a family." Christmas was loud. Christmas was chaotic. Christmas was 8 adults and 3 children in a 16 by 20 foot cabin with 1 bathroom and a wood stove and not enough chairs. So Tyler sat on the floor and George's children sat on the braided rug and Ren sat on Eudora's lap. Aunt and Marin stood in the kitchen making coffee in the old percolator and looking at the room and feeling something so large and unnameable that it filled her chest and pressed against her ribs and threatened to become sound. The carved birds were on the mantel. The drawing Ren had made at 3, the brown rectangle, the triangle, the smoke, the 2 stick figures, was framed now, hanging beside the door. Eudora had framed it herself. She'd asked Tyler to buy a frame in town, and she'd put the drawing in it and hung it at eye level, right where you'd see it when you walked in, so that the first thing anyone saw when they entered that cabin was a child's picture of a house with smoke coming from the chimney and 2 people in the doorway. And if you looked closely, which Marin always did, well, you could see that the taller stick figure was holding the smaller one's hand. After dinner, a turkey Tyler had brought, stuffing Dana had made, peaches from Eudora's pantry served over pound cake, Eudora asked for quiet. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stopped talking and waited, and the room followed, the way a room does when the person who stops talking is the one everyone has been listening to all along. She said, "Bernard built this cabin 60 years ago. He built it with wood from these trees and stones from that creek. He built it for me. And I've lived in it alone for 31 years, and most of those years I thought alone was what I deserved, or at least what I'd been given, and the 2 seemed like the same thing." She looked at Marin, and then a girl knocked on my door. She was carrying a baby. She was half frozen. I gave her broth and a blanket and a carved bird, and I didn't think about it again until she came back. And then she came back again, and then she kept coming back. And now I'm sitting in a room full of people on Christmas Day, and the fire is burning, and there's a child on my lap, and my sons are here, and I want to say something I've never said because I was always too proud, or too stubborn, or too used to the cold. She paused. She said, "Thank you. Thank you for coming. Not just today. Thank you for coming at all." And the room was quiet, the way rooms are quiet when something real has been said, when the words in the air are too true and too fragile to disturb with a response, and Ren leaned her head against Eudora's chest and closed her eyes, and outside the snow was falling again, soft and steady, and the fire was burning. We're in the cabin held. If you're hearing this right now and you're in the middle of the storm, if your car has slid off the road and the cold is coming through and you don't know where the door is, I want you to know something. The door is there. It might be invisible, it might be buried in snow, but someone, somewhere, is on the other side of it with a fire already lit. You just have to keep walking. Not because the universe owes you a rescue, not because things always work out, but because Marin Hollis walked 400 steps through a blizzard with a baby inside her coat, and on step 401, she found a door. And behind that door was a woman who had been waiting 31 years for someone to knock. Kindness is not a transaction. It's not a debt. It's a door. And sometimes you're the one who opens it. And sometimes you're the one who falls through it. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to be both.